Dear people watching and listening, Assalamu alaikum. Kindly like and share this video and subscribe to my YouTube channel. Please support my channel by contributing to my Patreon account so that I can continue making the audiobook series. Uqba marched from Barca with intent to conquer Africa and all beyond. In fact, so far as he was concerned, it was his intention to conquer the whole world. And if he failed to do so, it was not for lack of will on his part, but because the land finished and he could not go any further. But more of that later. He marched with an army of 10,000 men. There were some contingents from Syria and Egypt, sent by order of the Caliph to give him the required strength. But many regiments had been his for a long time, had campaigned with him in Africa, and were stationed as part of his garrison at Barca. These contingents included quite a few Berbers who had been converted by him to Islam. The march from Barca took place sometime in 50 Hijri, 670 AD. After 2 weeks' march, the army arrived at Sirte, and went into campaign. Here Uqba decided to delay the advance into the heart of Africa until the Libyans had been properly brought into line. And this was necessary because many of the Berber tribes in the region, which had pledged loyalty and tribute to the Muslims in the first conquest of Libya by amrbinalaas in 23 Hijri, had broken their pledge and refused to honor their agreement. So Uqba left the bulk of his army in camp at Surt and rode off with 800 mounted men, 400 horse and 400 camel, all equipped and prepared for long, waterless journeys. As his first objective, he chose Wadan. Upon arrival at Wadan, he attacked the place, and soon after the resistance of the inhabitants collapsed and the place was won. The king of Wadan, probably more of a big chief than king, renewed the pact made by amrbinalaas and agreed to abide by its terms. When this had been done, Uqba cut off the lobe of his ear. The king protested vehemently. "Why did you do this to me? You just made a pact with me." Uqba looked at him intently for a while. "I did that to teach you a lesson," he replied calmly. "Whenever you touch your ear, it will remind you not to fight the Arabs." Uqba collected 360 slaves, which was the number due from the people of Wadan under the old pact, and prepared to march on. He asked the people what lay beyond them. They spoke of Jarma, a city of Fezzan at a distance of 8 days' march. Uqba marched from Jarma. Upon completion of the journey, when he was 6 miles from the town, he stopped and went into camp. From here he sent messengers to the town demanding its surrender, and his demand was accepted by the people. No blood was shed. Jarma too had a king according to historians, but he too was probably nothing more than a big chief. However, he came out of the city with the intention of visiting the Muslim general and paying his respects. Once outside, he waited for his entourage, which was slow to get ready. Before it could join him, a Muslim cavalry squadron arrived on the spot and took up positions between the big chief and his city, and refused to let the others out. Even the big chief's horse was not allowed outside the town. They forced him to walk on his flat feet all the way to Uqba's headquarters. 6 miles is nothing as a walking distance, but this chief was a soft chief, a corpulent fellow apparently unused to exercise of any kind. When he arrived outside Uqba's tent, he was in an exhausted state. He even started to spit blood. It was certainly a very unimposing chief who stood panting and puffing before Uqba bin Nafe. "Why did you do this to me?" he asked piteously, "when I was coming to you willingly?" Uqba looked intently at the miserable fellow for a while, wondering what part of this king to remove. He decided that perhaps enough had been done to him for memory not to fail, He said, "As a lesson to you, whenever you remember this, you will not fight the Arabs." At Derma, a new pact was prepared because there was none from before this time, and its terms included a contribution of 360 slaves. The king was left alone and intact compared with his predecessor and his successor. For some weeks, Uqba moved around the region of Fezzan, discovering and subduing new forts, preaching Islam to their inhabitants, many of whom accepted the new faith. Then he turned his steps towards a place called Khawar, also called Jawan, which was big enough to be well known in the province. It took him 15 days to get there, and he arrived to find that it was a large fortified town. The Muslims laid siege and settled down to force the inhabitants into submission. But when a whole month had passed, and the defenders showed no sign of submitting, nor even apparently of suffering any hardship, Uqba decided that siege warfare was not really the right kind of fighting for the chivalrous Arab. He lifted the siege and went away from Khawar, this time going towards the border with the Sudan, to some place not known or even mentioned in the early histories. Here he found a town and captured it. Here also there was a chief who submitted and accepted the terms laid down by the victor. Uqba cut off his little finger. "Why did you do this to me?" the chief protested. "As a lesson to you," replied Uqba. "Whenever you look at your little finger, you will refrain from fighting the Arabs." The reader might imagine that Uqba had a rather impish sense of humor, but this is unlikely. His entire makeup was so serious, he was so obsessed with the ambition of fighting battles in the Holy War and spreading the word of God, that it would be unthinkable for him to do these things as a mischievous prank. He really meant to make sure that these tribes would remain faithful to Islam and not revolt against the Muslim power. And in this, he was entirely successful because the Berber tribes of Libya, with minor exceptions, never turned against Islam, and thus Uqba's unusual way of driving his point home was to their advantage. By discouraging revolt, it saved them from suffering the horrors of war, which included more painful losses than earlobes and little fingers. This last mentioned chief was the last man to lose a part of himself to Uqba's unusual methods. Uqba collected 360 slaves and returned to Khawar, which he had tried unsuccessfully to conquer in a recent siege. This time he passed by Khawar, making sure that he was seen by the inhabitants of the city and making no attempt to fight them. He traveled a distance of 3 days' march from it, then doubled back on his tracks and got to Khawar to find the inhabitants utterly unprepared for battle. Having taken them by surprise, he stormed the city and captured it at once. Many of the warriors defending the town were killed, and the town itself was taken by the Muslims as a prize of war. After this, he began his journey back to Surt. He went by Zawila, the capital of Fezzan, but there was no battle here because the people of Zawila had remained loyal to their pledge, and Uqba had been visiting the place in past years. On his way he found a few other places which resisted, and were taken by force of arms, and after an absence of 5 months, he rejoined the main body of his army at Surt. A few days later Uqba set the army in motion towards the west. He occupied Tripoli and from here sent a column to Ghudamis, a large city on the main route to the Sudan. The Sudan meant and was the region of the blacks. This column captured Ghudamis without difficulty and returned to join the army on the route of march. All the important places in the eastern part of Africa, including the province of Tripolitania, were now in Muslim hands. The Muslims went on to Lake Kafsa and the nearby district of Castilla, which included the towns of Tozar and Nafta. The remarkable thing about Castilla was that its people were dog eaters. They bred and fattened dogs for eating, and it is believed that they fed their dogs on dates. From Kafsa, Uqba sent a mounted column northwards as advance guard on the road to Susa under one of his lieutenants, who captured a fort near the city of Majana, 15 miles from Kafsa. The main body of the army moved up to join the advance guard, and here Uqba decided to stop for a while. Another year had begun, 51 Hijri. It began on 18 January 671.